Charles Duhigg. Thank you so much for coming on the Mindful Mama podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
I'm so happy you're here. Like I said, I've been a big fan of your work for so long. The Power of Habit, dear listener, you may be familiar with that book. I was, because all of these people wanted to know, how do I start meditation habit? And so I would just consult The Power of Habit.
Well, that's very kind of you to say.
I've recommended many a like gentle, healthy reward for your, whatever you're building. We maybe talk about that more later. But I love this new book too, because I'm obsessed with communication, and
thanks.
This is all about communication, super communicators, of course. But yeah, so I think that all our best learning comes from our mistakes, and in super communicators, you kind of start off talking about some mistakes you made in your work, but you also talk about some mistakes you made in your family and with your wife that led to some like really frustrated communication. Can you tell us about that?
Of course. Yeah. So one of the reasons I wrote Super Communicators, actually the origin of Super Communicators, was that I fell into this bad pattern with my wife. And, I'm a journalist. I used to work for the New York Times. Now I work for the New Yorker magazine. I sort of thought of myself as a good communicator. But I would come home from work after like a long day, and I'd start complaining about my day, like to my wife. I'd tell her like, my boss doesn't appreciate me and my coworkers don't realize what a genius I am. And she would offer me some really good advice. She would say something like, why don't you take your boss out to lunch and you can get to know him a little bit better. And instead of being able to hear what she was saying, I know this is familiar, I'm sure, to everyone listening. Instead of being able to hear what she was saying, I would get even more upset, right? I would like say like, why aren't you supporting me? You're supposed to be on my side. And she would get upset because I was attacking her for giving me good advice. I'm certain this happens in every relationship. And what's more, we know that it happens, and yet it still happens again and again and again. And so I went to these researchers and I was like, look, like if I'm such a good communicator, if I'm a journalist, why do I keep screwing this up? Not only at home, but with my kids and at work. And they said, well, it's actually interesting you came by right now, because we are living through this golden age of understanding communication because of advances in neural imaging and data collection. We know what's happening inside people's brains when they're talking to each other like never before. And one of the things that we found is that when you are having a discussion with someone, you usually assume that discussion is about one thing, right? You're discussing your day or where to go on vacation or, a budget at work. But actually they said what we've seen is that every discussion is made up of different kinds of conversations. And in general, these conversations tend to fall into one of three buckets. There's these practical conversations where we're making plans or solving problems. But then there's emotional conversations where I tell you what I'm feeling, and I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize, and I want you to relate. And then there's social conversations, which is about how we relate to each other, how we relate to society, the identities that are important to us every day. And they said one of the things that we found is that if two people are having different kinds of conversations, it's almost impossible for them to hear each other fully. And it's impossible for them to feel connected. And that's, of course, what was happening with me and my wife, right? I was having an emotional conversation. She was having a practical conversation. And they're both legitimate conversations. But we were like these ships passing in the night. But the researcher said, we've discovered this other thing. If you can somehow figure out what kind of conversation you're having, and if I can match you or invite you to match me, then even if we don't agree with each other, even if we don't like what the other person is saying, we're going to feel connected to each other. We're going to feel like we've got some kind of understanding with each other. And that's going to create trust and and, sort of closeness and affection. And within psychology, this has become known as the matching principle. It says that successful communication requires having the same kind of conversation at the same moment.
Yeah. I mean, that frustration you experience is like, it happens to so many people. And I'm curious, did you ask the researchers about kind of like which thing happens more, right? Because you might have been open to that logical, practical conversation if your wife had just kind of empathized with you a little first, like, oh my God, that's so frustrating, that's hard, whatever, right? And then, I have some ideas, do you want to, make that transition? But I'm curious about because in my mind, it seems like so many, and I'm not a researcher, I don't do math studies about this, I only have anecdotal evidence, but it seems like we want to have that emotional acknowledgement of the
Yeah.
emotions first, right? Like it seems like that seems, and then all these other conversations can happen as like, because the emotions are the listeners tired of hearing me say this, but I feel like they're like little toddlers standing at our legs, pulling, waiting to be acknowledged, like see me, hear me, and then go on with the rest of your life. So
I think
did you
that's
ask about
exactly
that?
right. Yeah. Well, so what's interesting is that once we become aligned, once we're having the same kind of conversation at the same moment, what tends to happen is that we can switch from conversation to conversation together almost seamlessly. And it doesn't take very long to get to alignment, right? As you pointed out, like now when I complain, my wife says like, "Oh, I'm really sorry that like you had such a hard day. Do you want me just to listen, or do you want me to help you solve this problem?" And then, or she'll say like, now, I understand how you're feeling. Can we talk about some solutions? That's all it takes for us to move together from an emotional conversation to a practical conversation. But one of the things I think you're asking is, which of these conversations is more prevalent? Which of these conversations? And the truth, what we found is that actually about 70% of our conversations are social conversations. More so than practical, more so than emotional. However, because many of us have been habituated in the language of practicality, we tend to default to that, even when we're talking about emotional topics. So I might not realize that I want to have an emotional conversation with you, because I might come into the conversation and say, okay, look, I'm kind of upset because like we're off budget, so we need to sit down, we need to figure out like which subscriptions we're going to cancel. That sounds like a practical conversation. But the important part of it is me saying, I'm upset because we're off budget. I'm upset. This is an emotional conversation first and foremost. And until we acknowledge that, then it's going to be really hard for us to move together to the practical.
Yeah, yeah. I think this is what you're framing a problem that we have in so many different areas, I think, in the family. And that's like a lot of like our kids coming to us. It feels like most of the things feel like a practical conversation. You don't relate to the emotion behind the problem that your 3-year-old or 14-year-old is having, because you have the big picture. You don't see it as such a big problem, but to them it's a really big problem. And we jump to practical, or we're not in the same conversation. We're not acknowledging that, giving each other some of that empathy.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And sometimes it's just a matter of literally just showing empathy. And then at that moment, the emotional conversation can kind of be set aside for something that's either practical or social or deeper.
Yeah, yeah. The toddler has been like, I'm seen and heard.
Exactly.
70% of our conversations are social. It's like, what would be an example of that?
So really, anytime you talk about yourself, or you talk about someone else, or you talk about how you relate to other people. So for instance, me telling a story about my wife is actually a social conversation, because I'm describing to you a dynamic that exists between these people. Or I might say, for instance, as a journalist, this is what I think. I'm describing an identity that's important to me, so a way that I see the world. And what's important is that when we hear someone say something like that, when we hear someone tell a story about their relationship with their wife, when we hear them say, as a journalist or as a woman in the workplace, our instinct might be to do one of two things: either to empathize, right? Oh, that must be so hard. But that's not actually what you're looking for when you say, like, as a woman in the workplace. I'm not looking for someone to empathize
Yeah,
with
yeah,
me.
yeah.
It's a social statement. I'm looking for someone to acknowledge who I am. Right? When I say like I was having this conversation with my wife and she got upset, I'm not looking for you to solve that problem with my wife. I'm looking for you to acknowledge, like, that sounds like a hard situation, and it sounds like you're coming at it from different places, and I imagine that that's difficult for you. That's a challenge in your relationship. So when it comes to practical conversations, what we're often looking for is we're looking for a solution. When it comes to emotional conversations, we're often looking for empathy. Someone simply to say like, I hear what you're saying and I feel for you. But when we're having a social conversation, we're often looking for acknowledgement, not empathy, not a solution, but someone just to say, I see you. And in fact, in schools, they teach teachers to do this by telling them if a student comes up and they have something important they want to talk about, teachers should start the conversation by saying, would you like to be helped, hugged, or heard in this discussion?
That's
and of
brilliant.
course, that's the practical, the emotional, and the social. And if kids know exactly what they want.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I was watching your TED Talk Charles did a great TED talk on this. Do you want to be helped, hugged, and heard? I mean, that, that's definitely something we could take as parents or in any people, just people in any relationship, and use that, maybe not at the New York Times or whatever, but like at home, we could,
Yeah.
say, do you want to be helped, hugged, or heard? These are great, great questions to ask.
And you're right. It's hard to ask that in a workplace, right? Or it's hard. Or sometimes if we're talking to our spouse, if we're talking to our kids, it's okay. If we're talking to our spouse, and we say, "Do you want to be helped, hugged, or heard?" They might be a
You
little
might get
offended.
an FU.
Yeah, it might seem a little patronizing, but there's actually a solution to this, which is the reason why that question works is because it's what's known as a deep question. And a deep question is something that asks us about our values or beliefs or experiences. And what we found is that the way to figure out what kind of conversation is happening is to ask someone a deep question. And it can sound kind of intimidating when I put it that way, but it's as simple as like if you met someone who was a doctor, instead of asking them like, "What hospital do you work at?" asking them, "Oh, what made you decide to go to medical school?" Right? That second question, that invites them to tell us who they are. And inevitably, they're going to tell us what kind of mindset they're in.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And you talk in your TED talk about a doctor who used this, and I want you to share that story. But first, I have an experience with these deep conversations. Have you heard of Dave Fleischer, the founder of Deep Canvassing?
No.
So during the election in West Philadelphia, this group, there's this guy Dave Fleischer who founded this kind of canvassing called deep canvassing, and it's been shown to be the most effective form of canvassing by leaps and bounds over every other kind of canvassing. And what they did, and I went and did it once because I got so sort of stressed out by the whole experience of it that I could only do it once, sadly. But anyway, I went once, I got the training, and they train you to ask to have a conversation about what do you love. So you go to a training, you learn to share a story about someone you love who's important to you in your life, and you tell a little story about them. And in this deep canvassing, I would go to these houses in West Philadelphia, real, deeply impoverished neighborhood, knock on the doors. And I got to have a couple of these conversations. I got to talked about my daughter and, her challenges with her medical condition and how I'm voting, I'm voting for her, the people I love. And I would ask them, tell me about someone you love. And I got to hear about this person's mother and how she was so important and strong. She did all these things. And it was so interesting because it really cut through all the BS. I felt so connected to the two people I ended up having these conversations with. And apparently it's very effective for canvassing, but it's really scary.
Well, okay, so it's really interesting. I'm not familiar with this particular guy, but what he's doing builds on this research that comes from two researchers, one of whom is at Yale and the other is at Penn, who basically tried a bunch of different methods, and they found that this deep canvassing method is the most effective way to change people's minds. And so in their case, what they would do is they were in California and they were talking about trans rights. And they would go to places where, so they wanted to find and they went to really Republican areas, really conservative areas in California. And they wanted to find a topic that is a really tough topic, right? They did also some work on gay marriage before it was legalized by the Supreme Court. And what they found was the most effective thing is exactly what you just said, is to come to someone. And you can upfront say, look, I'm here to talk to you about some political issues. And then just say, can I tell you a story about my Uncle Ray?
Yeah.
And the person usually says sure, you can tell me a story about your Uncle Ray. And it's Ray's been in this committed relationship for 15 years and it's with this man. And oftentimes you can start it by asking a deep question, by saying according to my sheet here, you're opposed to gay marriage. Can you just tell me why? Right? And then just listen. Don't try and change their mind. Don't make counter arguments. And inevitably people say things like, well, I think that marriage should be for having children, right? And if you're gay, you can't have children. And so there shouldn't be gay marriage. At which point you can say, let me tell you about my Uncle Ray. He's been with his partner for 15 years. They actually adopted a kid, but they're not recognized as his parents because gay marriage isn't legal yet. And I just want Ray to be able to be a good parent, exactly what you just said. And as long as we do that as long as we both tell our stories, we engage in what's known as reciprocal authenticity,
Mm-hmm.
and we do not judge each other, then we will feel closer to each other. We'll feel like we understand each other better. That does not mean that we will agree with each other, right? So what they found is that on average, they could change 3 to 5% of people's minds on an issue. And 3 to 5% is not that much, but in politics, it's everything, right? Oftentimes races are won or lost based on 3 to 5%. But even if you don't change the person's mind, they walk away feeling like they're connected to you. And that oftentimes gives them a better sense of the issue that you're talking about.
Yeah.
But you brought up a second issue, which is that it can be really tiring. It can be really sort of emotionally exhausting.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, why did it feel so?
Well, I do want to talk about like relationships in the family, but for me, it was exhausting because it's just very stressful environment. In general, it's like a little bit of a scary environment for somebody. And then B, I actually got hit on by a guy immediately, really aggressively, and that was made. I already felt.
I'm sorry, I'm laughing. That's terrible. That is
felt a little unsafe, and then I felt really unsafe, and so it was just like my nerves were like I was like frizzed out nerves for like the whole day.
I completely understand that. That is completely inappropriate. That should not have happened to you. So here's the one thing I will say that we know based on the research. There's not a lot of research on when you get hit on by random strangers, and I apologize. I'm so sorry that happened to you. But we do know that when we have these kinds of conversations, they get easier the more frequent we have them. So my guess is if you had gone back for a second day, you would have found that second day to be a lot easier than the first day. And the reason why is because our brains have evolved to make communication happen, to latch onto communication habits very quickly. Like if we practice something just once or twice in communication, our brain will start making it into a habit almost immediately. And there's actually a guy named Nicholas Epley who has done experiments on this. Once a month, he'll get on a bus in Chicago. He's a professor at the University of Chicago. And his goal is to sit down next to a stranger and get them talking about their hopes and dreams within 3 questions.
Oh my God.
And when he told me that, I was like, that sounds impossible and awful. Like, there's no way. The same thing you were saying. Like, there's no way I want to sit down next to someone and have some random conversation about their hopes and dreams. And he's like, no, it's great. It actually only usually takes about 2 questions. Because usually, I introduce myself and I'm like, hey, what do you do for a living? And they're like, oh, I'm an accountant. And he says, oh, did you always want to be an accountant? Was that your dream when you were a kid? And they say, no, who wants to be an accountant when they're a kid? I wanted to be an astronaut. But now suddenly you're talking about how life works, right? That they met someone in college and they got married and they have these kids now and they love being an accountant to their surprise. So I would say that it can sound intimidating, but it just takes a little bit of practice and suddenly we get really good at it.
Okay, in 3.5 years, I'll practice again.
Okay. Hopefully, and maybe you can be like, keep me away from the creeps. Like, let's take the creeps off the list.
Can I walk around with a really large guy, please? So you talk about all these, you have all these communication tips. I think is so great. Like, there's all these things to realize, like whether someone is, connecting with what you're saying, and are they leaning in, the body language, which is so important because I don't know, there's a huge percentage, right, of our communication that is nonverbal. And I was thinking about this with couples, and you talk about this idea of shared goals. So I was wondering, how can couples figure out and talk about their shared goals so that when they're in a disagreement, they can work together a little bit better?
It's a great question. And there's a ton of research, and a lot of it in super communicators that I go into, of very specific tactics you can use. And the first and most important thing I think you can do is you can just start the conversation by acknowledging that it might be a hard conversation, right? Like, if you're going to sit down and talk about money, to say, like, look, if you don't mind, I would like us to talk about our budget. I know that this is going to be an awkward conversation. I know it's going to be hard. And I might say the wrong thing. Like, the gap between my brain and my lips. Sometimes, what I mean comes out wrong, and I hope you'll forgive me. And I promise, if you do that, I will forgive you. So that's the first thing to do.
So I just want to say, like, your opening yourself up in a place of vulnerability that way. Like you're not coming at it,
Absolutely.
for the listener, I'm holding a fist up and another fist up, with all a bunch of defensiveness. You're opening up with honesty and vulnerability, which is a great way to be because we don't want to hit someone who's down.
Exactly. And equally importantly, we're not saying I have all the answers
Yeah, yeah.
and you need to listen to me. What we're saying is, I want to do this together. This is going to be awkward for both of us, but I think it's important. And I want us to be a team on that. And that's really powerful. So that's the first thing you can do. The next thing you can do is it's often really helpful just to identify a goal. And sometimes the goal can be as simple as like, I'd like us to walk away from this conversation deciding on 3 subscriptions that we're going to quit tonight. Small goals are really, really helpful because they help us structure that conversation and they prevent something that's known as kitchen sinking. So kitchen sinking is literally the single most destructive pattern for a married couple or other relationship couple to get into. And what kitchen sinking is that when we start arguing about one thing, we always end up arguing about everything. Right? So we start arguing about where we're going to spend Thanksgiving. And then it becomes like, your mom hates me and I don't like her and we don't earn enough money. And if you worked harder, we'd have enough money to be able to go on the vacations. So like suddenly every single problem becomes like a 5-alarm fire. So how do we avoid kitchen sinking? Well, the number one way is simply to identify a goal. Is to say like, look, I'd like us to talk about where we're going to spend Thanksgiving. And my goal is to decide if we're going to your mom's house or my mom's house for Thanksgiving. And like, let's not talk about like money or like whether our moms like us or not. We can put that off. Those are legitimate conversations, but let's have that conversation later. Let's just decide right now, like what do we need to figure out to determine where we should spend Thanksgiving. When we do that, what we're doing is we're not only making the issue smaller for ourselves, which feels really good, but we're becoming a team. Now we have a shared purpose. We have a shared question. We're on the same side of the table, and we're trying to answer that question or solve that problem together. And that's really powerful.
I love this. And I wonder if we could I'm trying to think of like one of the most challenging questions that the listener has and some of the most challenging conversations that listeners have are sometimes when one partner is not on the same page as the other in how you're going to parent. Right. So I was listening to and trying to sort of translate it in my head to what that might be, and I was thinking like, might it be something like, can we sit down and have a conversation about how we respond to Joey, when we have to leave the house in the morning and he gets upset or whatever, something like that.
Totally. Or okay, look, I want to talk about something with you. And I know that this is something that's like kind of hard to talk about. So I just want to apologize in advance, but I think it's important. I want to talk about like you and I have different standards for how frequently the kids can be using their phones. Like, I feel like we shouldn't use the phones at the dinner table. We shouldn't use the phones when we're together. It seems like you have you feel differently about this. Can you tell me a little bit about how you feel about it?
And curiosity.
Right? And my goal is for us to just come up with some rule that we're both really comfortable with. Some rule that we think works for both of us. Right? If you start the conversation that way, or if like, I want to talk about when we leave in the morning and our kid gets upset, like my goal is for us to have like some behavior that we both think is the right thing to do. And that's easy for us. Like, here's how I feel. Tell me how you feel. Like when you do that, that doesn't mean that necessarily like suddenly the answer is obvious, but it means that you can find the answer together. And that's going to make it much, much better.
Yeah. You're saying like, this is where I am on this, this is the kind of the need, this is the need we need met, right? We need this thing met.
Exactly.
This is our goal. And, and I love that you had that curiosity question, like, where, I wonder how you feel about this, right? And also framing it, what Charles did really beautifully is frame it in a very non-judgmental way. It seems like you feel differently about rather than unskillful things.
Why do you keep screwing this up? Right?
Yes.
Well, I'm right and you're wrong. Why can't you see that? Yeah, that almost never works.
No, that doesn't work very well. Yeah, and I was wondering, you have there's some strategies. What strategies do you have for persuading a partner to kind of meet you halfway without it feeling like the other one is always giving in? Like, say, if what happens a lot is like one parent has gotten themselves really educated about stuff and is all up on all the information, all the research, and the other partner may feel like, I always have to do it your way. Any tips or advice for this sort of scenario?
So I think there's a couple of things. The first is the value of asking permission is really, really high. So instead of saying, look, let me tell you what we should do about phones, because I just read this study and I've read 7 studies all about how kids should use phones. Like suddenly you're Mr. Know-it-all or Mrs. Know-it-all, and I'm like the ignoramus, right? But if I start that by saying, like I think this phone stuff is really interesting. Is it okay if I tell you like some of the studies I've read? And I'm just curious like what you make of them. When I ask your permission to give you information, what I'm doing is 2 things. First of all, instead of forcing you, I'm inviting you. But secondly, what I'm doing is I'm framing that information as I would like to hear your thoughts on this. Not I'm the smart one, you're the dumb one, I'm going to tell you the facts, you're going to listen. But rather, I've been exposed, I read this paper, and if you don't mind, I'd love to share it with you, but I want to hear what you think about it. Like, because you are as legitimate an interpreter of this research as I am. And we're equals in this conversation. So that's the first thing that I would say. The second thing that I would say is that when we are in those situations, it's really important to understand what the goal of a conversation is, right? If I come into a conversation and I think I already have the answers, that's not actually I'm not really looking for a conversation. What I'm looking for is for you to like agree with me. And that's probably unlikely if it's a tough subject. So the goal of a conversation is not to convince you that I'm right and you're wrong, or I know more than you, or I'm smart, or you should like me, or you should be impressed. The goal of a conversation is to understand how the other person sees this issue and to speak in such a way that they can understand you. And even if you walk away from that conversation still disagreeing with each other, even if I say, I'm going to vote for my guy, you're going to vote for your guy, but if I understand why you like your candidate and you understand why I like my candidate, we're going to feel closer to each other. And frankly, we're going to find a lot of things that we do agree on.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this would be a great way to also frame like a conversation with the previous generation, about parenting or, the way you're raising your kids or doing things differently. And I have some information here. I wonder what you think about this, right? Like inviting their input rather than just completely holding a boundary, which may also be valid too, in certain situations, but like maybe then also considering the idea of inviting their input and their perspective and their experience into it.
Can you imagine how different it would be if your mother-in-law, instead of your mother-in-law saying like, oh, that's how you feed the baby? Oh, that's not how I did it. That doesn't make that's probably, that's not great, right? Suddenly you're like, whatever, get out of my house. But if she was to say like, hey, I noticed that you're feeding the baby. Can't tell you like about something I did when I was younger. And like, I'm not saying that you should do it. I'm just bringing it up because like, I'm curious, like what you think of it, right? If it's something that might be helpful. Suddenly I am no longer like the person who's telling you how it has to be. I'm the person who's just like offering something to like, here's how I see the world. Like when I was raising your husband, I wouldn't feed him sugar all the time. And this is why like this, but maybe I'm wrong. And like, I know you're the mom, like you've done more research more recently. Tell me what you think of that.
Maybe 100% sugar diet is great for your kid.
And you know what? Your daughter-in-law might say, actually, I'm going to stick with the sugar. But that's okay, because at least she knows how you feel, and maybe she's going to think about it later.
Yeah. And the lines of communication are open.
Exactly.
And you're preserving that interconnection and that
yes,
that
and
value.
You can have that conversation again later on when it's easier to hear alternatives.
Okay, so what are some of the best ways we can respond to our kids or our partner when they are in an emotionally heightened state?
Yeah.
What do we do then?
So the absolute best thing we can do, not just when they're in an emotionally heightened state, but when we're talking about anything that's important, but particularly if they're feeling emotional, is all the research shows it's not enough to listen to them. You have to prove that you're listening to them. You have to show them that you're listening. Because if I'm all riled up, right? I'm upset, I'm crying, I'm talking about something that's really meaningful to me, and I'm worried that you're not going to take it seriously. There is part of my brain that suspects, so no matter how much I love you, there's part of my brain that suspects you aren't actually listening. You're waiting your turn to speak, right? Even if you look like you're listening, even if you're nodding with me and you're going, I wonder, are you actually listening? So there's a technique to prove that we're listening. And it's called looping for understanding, and it has 3 steps. Step 1 is ask a question, preferably a deep question if you can, right? Something about, why is this important to you? How do you make sense of this? Then, after the person answers the question, repeat back what you heard them say in your own words. And what's important here is the goal is not mimicry. It's not to repeat what they said. It's to show them that you were paying attention, and more importantly, to show them that you were thinking about it. That, oh, what I heard you say was this one thing. And that reminds me of something you said last week, right? I proved to you that I'm listening to you. So most people do steps 1 and 2 somewhat intuitively when we're our best selves. It's step 3 is the one that I always forget, which is after you repeat back what you heard them say in your own words, ask if you got it right.
Good.
Because what we're really doing when we ask, did I hear you correctly? Am I understanding what you're saying? What I'm really doing in that moment is I'm asking you for permission to acknowledge that I was listening. And when you acknowledge that I'm listening, then all of a sudden I become much more likely to listen to you. It's that proving that we're listening. And with kids, this is incredibly important, right? Because a kid comes up and they have a problem and they're crying about something and Jimmy just hit me and it's not fair and I want dessert. And our instinct is to solve the problem. Like, oh, just don't go play with Jimmy, right? Or no, you can't have dessert because you haven't had dinner yet. But if we start by saying, honey, I hear what you're saying. I hear that Jimmy was really, really mean to you and that hurts your feelings. And I know that you really want to be friends with Jimmy. You told me last week how much you like Jimmy. I understand. Did I get that right? Am I understanding what you're saying? That kid is going to believe that you are listening to them. And at that point, they're going to listen to anything else you say.
Yeah, you're connected. Yeah, that's really interesting. I call that, in Raising Good Humans, I call that kind of listening, like reflective listening, like reflecting back. But I love the idea of the looping with that, the looping for understanding. And I really have a wonderful visual picture of like the loop that you're both are in. It's so beautiful. Yeah. And it's, I mean, you know the research, right? Like it's really shows to lower the temperature emotionally, right? For people when they feel so heard and understood that way.
Absolutely. And so like conversations with partners, for instance, what are known as conflict conversations within the academic literature, where we disagree with each other or we're talking about something that that's just hard to talk about. Looping for understanding actually changes the tenor of the conversation entirely. It's the research at Harvard and elsewhere have shown it's the single most effective way to reduce the tension in a conflict conversation, whether it's at home or at work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Take that, write that down, dear listener. So I really enjoy Super Communicators, and you end with a beautiful story from the Harvard study of adult development. And I was wondering if you could just kind of tell us the story of how Godfrey developed as an adult and what was most important.
Yeah, so the Harvard study of adult development has been going on for almost 80 years now. And it's a fairly famous study because it's so big and it's so long lasting. For this whole period, researchers have followed around thousands of people. And what they do is they send them a survey every 2 years. They do a big intake where they spend 3 days with them measuring everything. And then every 2 years, they get this huge questionnaire that they have to fill out. And if they don't fill it out, someone goes to their house and actually does it with them. And the goal of the study was to try and figure out, at first, what makes us live longer, right? What makes us, when we hit age 65, what makes us healthier and happier and more successful, however you define success. And so because this started in the 1930s, they had a bunch of crazy theories, like is at Harvard. So they figured if you went to Harvard, you're probably going to be really happy and healthy and successful. And turns out that's not true at all. They figured if you got married and never got divorced, that would help. And that turned out to be much less true than they thought it was going to be. They went through all these different things and they found there was actually only one thing that predicted if at age 65 you were going to be happy, healthy, and successful. And that's having a handful of close relationships at age 45. Because if you have close relationships at age 45, you've probably had them for a while and you probably continue to have them. It's our relationships with other people that matter. And you mentioned Godfrey Camille, which is actually a made up name by the researchers. We don't know what the individual's real name is. But he came into this study when he was at Harvard. This is pre-World War II. And he basically was a mess. Like, he didn't have any friends. He was really socially awkward. He came from this, at that moment, Harvard had a lot of like prominent families. He came from an unprominent family. He goes into the war effort like all other Harvard students. He basically does not distinguish himself at all in the military. Then he leaves the military and he goes to medical school, and he becomes so depressed that he actually attempts suicide. And this is at a time when, like, if you're suicidal, you're basically a pariah, right? So he's allowed to finish medical school, but no one will hire him. And so he was enrolled in this program, and the researchers were like, look, this guy's a mess. Like, we'll continue following him, but we know what the ending of the story is going to be like. Like, he's going to end up either dead from alcoholism or dead from suicide and alone and lonely. And so they continue serving him and the other people in the project. And then at some point they actually run out of money, like in the late 1960s. And so they stopped doing the surveys for a couple of years, for like a decade. They stopped doing it. And then eventually someone remembers that this thing exists, and they got more money and they started doing it again. And they go and they track this guy down and track Godfrey down. And to their surprise, he's incredibly happy and successful. He has a ton of friends. He started his own medical clinic in Boston. He was a national expert on allergies. He was like really involved in his church. He was a deacon in his church. And they continue following him. He lives until I think the age of like 72. And right before he dies, he goes on this like epic adventure to Antarctica with a bunch of his friends where they like cross the ice floes. And he comes back and he passes away from natural causes. And his funeral is huge. Like the archbishop comes and speaks at his funeral. Like there's hundreds and hundreds of people who show up. And so researchers are totally bewildered by this. They're trying to figure out, like, this guy seemed like he was on the path to total misery. What happened? And they started looking at the answers he had given in all the surveys. What had happened was, at one point, after his suicide attempt, he had gotten sick with, I think it was tuberculosis or something like that. It was something where you basically have to go and recover for like a year and a half. And so he went to this hospital probably in like New Mexico or Colorado in some dry state to recover. And he was so bored that he just decided to start doing things. Like there was like a prayer circle. And so he joined the prayer circle. He wasn't very religious, but he's like, I'm just bored on a Wednesday, so I'm going to go do this. And there were guys who played cribbage, and he would go and play cribbage with them. And there were guys who took a walk every afternoon. He started taking a walk with them every afternoon. And after about 9 months of this, he realized he was happy, right? He was happy because he had met all these people, because he was enmeshed in this community, because he had conversations with people every single day. And that's what was missing from his previous life, is connecting with other people. And the way he described it is, he said, he discovered that love is the most important thing on earth. Now, at that point in time, love doesn't necessarily mean romantic love, right? It means companionship and closeness.
Yeah. And
that's what the Harvard Study for Adult Development has found, is that the best investment you can make in your own life, literally the thing that will make you healthier. The Surgeon General has said being lonely is the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. The thing that will make you healthier and happier and more successful, because you'll get exposed to other opportunities that you didn't know about, is having close relationships, nurturing close relationships. And that doesn't mean you have to talk to someone every day. It doesn't mean you have to talk to them every month. But it does mean that you need to create some time to reach out to that friend that you haven't talked to in 9 months and call them up and say, hey, I just wanted to reconnect. I know it's going to be a little uncomfortable at first because we have to get updated on each other's life, but I really like you, and I want to have a conversation.
Yes. I think that's I really wanted to share that. I love the stories from the Harvard Study of Adult Development, because I think that's that it really highlights that interconnection that we have. We think we're so independent. We think we're these autonomous blobs just sort of floating around in our little Wally carts with like our big sippy cups, you know. And we, yeah, you know, as parents, our happiness is our kids' happiness, our ease, our peace is our kids, and the connections we make with other people, it makes them happier, makes us happier, all of that. It's so,
And
so
anyone who's
beautiful.
listening knows, like, as your kids get older, so my kids are 13 and 16, and one of them is actually away at school, so he doesn't live at home with us. And we talk to him every single day. He calls every single day. It's kind of hard to talk to your kids, particularly when they're teenagers, right? They're just like it's work. It's, how is school? Good. Did you learn anything? No. But when we do that work, when we teach them how to have conversations, we are actually investing in our happiness and their happiness and this lifelong relationship. It's well worth doing, even if it's hard.
Yes, yes. And your book, Super Communicators, can help us do that. Super Communicators, everywhere books are sold, so I recommend that you go get it. Dear listener, Charles Duhigg, this has been such a pleasure. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you for having me on.